I'm your producer, Todd Bartu, and this is Offshore Explorer. Offshore Explorer looks at the world from the sailor's point of view, port by port. Together, we share stories that detail the important intersections between sailing culture and life, past, present, and future. Coming up on today's episode, when things go wrong, there are things we hope to never use, but keep them just in case. What happens when you have to use them? But first, let me introduce our host, a lifelong sailor who has traveled the world, from mega yachts to tugboats to iceboats, and a published author who has written for both stage and screen, Captain Scott Dodgson.
Hello, Todd. How are you this fine January afternoon?
I'm doing great. What's today's episode about?
Today's episode is titled Just in Case. I make the argument for the concept and notion of preparing for things that might happen, just in case, kinds of things as being very much a part of the sailor's mind, more than, say, other endeavors, such as being on land and even flying. I mean, with boats, we seem to have a lot of just in case. And there's a real depth of historical just in caseness, as you might say, that goes back from, really starts back at the introduction of Fulton's steamboat. And that's where, and that idea consistently remains today as a kind of a ghost idea that we all prepare just in case something is going to be crazy and happening.
Okay, great. Take it away, Scott. Todd here. Do you like what you're hearing? Do you wish there was a way you could thank us for all of our hard work? Well, now you can. You can buy us a coffee. That's right. Just go to ko-fi.com/Offshore Explorer, and you can buy us a coffee. I'll leave the link in the show notes so you can go to it directly. Scott and I thank you for listening. Now, back to the show.
In 1967, I was 15 and a half. I think I was 15 and a half for the entire year until I actually turned 16, which was in November of that year. But I had such a desire to be 16 because I knew that I could drive the car by myself. But I made a deal with something that I really had a passion for, which was, at the time, sailing. And my grandfather, who was also a sailor and loved to sail around his little dory, and, he would sail it around in Jersey, out in the bay. And it would be a place where he could just sail and think, whatever the case may be. The dory was very good. And Egg Harbor Bay has got a lot of mud flats and channels, like sort of any sort of saltwater bay. But it was fun sailing. You could sail around. It was good, clean wind, either coming off the ocean or coming off the shore. So it was a good place to learn how to sail and to sail. Not very many waves, because it was enclosed, but it was still, it was just a super nice place to sail. So I made this deal with my grandfather about a boat that we had seen. We watched this man put the boat in. I really can't picture it any more than seeing it being dropped in the water by a little crane. And the boat was a 21-foot sloop. It was a Offshore designed boat that this man had built in his garage. And it was beautiful. It was just gorgeous. It was, it was varnished. It was bright. It was perfect. It was just gorgeous. The guy was a true craftsman. I mean, he did everything. He built the masts. They were wood, and it was deck stepped. They were round. I mean, just the loving detail that went into this boat was really quite amazing. And we watched him the first day he put it in the water, and let us sit there. And they had actually left it overnight because they wanted the water to get into the wood and swell the wood up a little bit, so it wouldn't be a problem. They had a pump. They had a little electric pump in there, just in case water came through the boat. There wasn't a prop. There wasn't an engine. It was just a sailboat. So after seeing this, we both started to talk about, boy, that would be really great to have. And my grandfather just came out of the blue and said, well, we could buy a boat like that, and you could have it, but you'll have to pay me back. And this is in lieu of buying you a car. Big decision on my part. Car, girls, guys having fun, driving around, or a boat. I eventually made the decision to go with the boat. And I didn't know if we were going to get this boat. I was just we were just speculating on the boat. So later in the summer, my grandfather came back. He had been out sailing by himself, as he often did. And he came back and he said, the guy wants to sell the boat. Let's go take a look at it. So we went and took a look at the boat. The boat didn't have a name, by the way. And, the sails were all new, and the boat was just beautiful. And the guy, my grandfather started to talk to him, and the guy was like very upset. And I couldn't figure out why, because, back in those days when you were a kid or a young man, you just didn't stand next to adults when they were having adult conversations. You had to they didn't want to see you. They're having an adult conversation. It doesn't include you. Get the hell out of here. So I was just sort of looking at the boat, and I remember I was, fascinated with the little running lights, and like, wow, they're so shiny, and they're red, and they're green, I was just mesmerized by this boat. And as it turns out, this guy, he actually was building the lifeguard boats. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with this, but in Jersey, they used to have these big rowing lifeguard boats go out to rescue people in, and it's a big deal. The lifeguards row out, and they have teams, and they have races, and they're wood boats. And that's what this guy did. He built these boats. Now, there was a lot of them. You see them sometimes overturned on the beach just so the water doesn't get in them, and then the lifeguards come and they slide them down into the ocean, and they go rowing, and they go out to rescue somebody caught in the surf. And they're great boats. They're strong, and they're built of wood, and you got to have some thrust on those oars to make a move. So anyway, this is what this guy did. He built these boats. And as it turns out, he had this fantasy, dream, that he was going to enjoy sailing, that was going to be his thing. Sailing was going to be, better than rowing. He went in this boat, he built this boat with tons of love, went out sailing, came back, thought it was the worst experience in his entire life. He got seasick. He didn't like waiting on the wind. He couldn't figure out how to handle the wind, and he just wasn't going to have anybody tell him how to sail and be a better sailor. He just refused. And my grandfather offered to him, in a casual way, yeah, I can help you a little bit. And, there was just this big hullabaloo, and this guy was so upset. And my grandfather says, let me buy the boat from you. And the guy was just like, I could see in his eyes, I kind of sidled over a little bit closer so I could hear the conversation. And, I'm 15 and a half, pimply little kid with frizzy black hair sticking out all over the place. And the guy just says, $850. And my grandfather, he just looked at him and he says, deal. So he says, I got my checkbook in the car. Will you take a check? Will you take a check? And of course, back then, people always took checks. Checks were sacred, You gave somebody a check, that was the real deal. Just like money. So my grandfather went back and he wrote a check for $850, and the guy he had the papers for the boat because it had to be registered, car registration. It was registered in the state of New Jersey. And so we had the little stickers and all the rest of that stuff on the boat. And that was the deal. Then that afternoon, I was the proud owner of a boat. Well, my grandfather was the proud owner. I just had to pay him back. And I had a job during the school year. I had jobs to pay him back. Now, what you have to understand is $850 back then, 1967, was a lot of money. I mean, I think the minimum wage was $1.15, right? And you work 40 hours for, $50 a week, and people could live on that. That's the other thing people don't realize. You could live on that. And my grandfather wasn't a rich man, but he had worked in the newspaper. He was a newspaper man, and he was a union man. And they had saved money. My grandmother and my grandfather, they had bought a house down in Ocean City, New Jersey, and they had a lot of things going for them. Anyway, so it was up to me to pay him back, but I was just so thrilled to have this boat. And when all my friends would come to me and say, "Hey, Scott, why don't you get a car? Why do you have to keep bumming rides off us?" I said, "No, I got a boat, man." And that was like, okay. They would go like, "Oh, you have a boat. Can we go on the boat?" "Yeah, man, you can go on the boat." "Okay, you can ride in my car then." And that was the way things work. I mean, I wasn't really all that interested in girls at that point, but anytime we did go out, it was always a double or triple date in the same car, and my friends would drive, and I always got the ride on the promise of taking everybody out on my sailboat, which I might add, I very rarely ever did, because in summer everybody went their different ways, vacationed in different towns, and so I very rarely saw anybody in the summer that I could take sailing, but I was very willing to take them sailing. So I just went out and I started to sail this little boat. I named it Steppenwolf. After the book, after the band, it was sort of like my thing, Herman Hesse. I was a big reader back then and still am, and that was the deal. So Steppenwolf was the name of the boat. So I went out a few times, late in the season, like school had already started, and we would come back on it was after Labor Day. We would come back, I think it was like in October, when you still had those sort of warm sunny days, cold nights, brisk wind kind of concept going on, and it was a really kind of great thing. And so I used to go out. The little marina where we kept the boat was a good distance, but it was bicycle riding distance. So I used to ride my bike from the house over to the marina, and then I'd go out on the boat. And I would go out and I'd go sailing around. I'd run across the mud flats, and we had a routine. I had bought some crab traps, and my grandmother, who would not eat chicken or any fowl, long story, but in any case, she would give me chicken fat and whatever chicken was around, because she would cook it for everybody, and I'd put them in the traps, and then we would go out sailing, put the traps out on the mud flats, go out sailing, and you come back and they'd be filled with soft shell crabs. It was a great time, abundance of the ocean, abundance of the bay. It was fantastic. Well, one time it was late in the afternoon and we were coming back. I say we, I meant the boat and I. And we were coming back to pick up the little mooring that I had. And the wind died. And the tide was going out. And as the wind died and the tide was going out, I ended up getting stuck on a mud flat. Well, it took forever to get the boat off the mud flat. I was out of the boat. I was pushing the boat off the mud. I was standing in the mud up to my knees. I could feel the crabs biting me and, say, hey, there's the guy who caught my cousin, Eddie. No, I haven't seen him since. Let's get him. There was all that kind of jazz going on. I had no way of getting the boat from pretty far out in the bay back to the marina. So I was essentially just stranded until the wind picked up and I could sail back. Well, it got to be late. The sun went down, and it gets in October. The sun goes down kind of early in Jersey, and I wasn't moving. I was just sitting there. I got off the mud flats and I was just sitting there, and I started to move with the tide. The tide at the time was going out, so I could actually literally kind of use the rudder to steer the boat around through the tide, and it was working towards taking me out Townsend's Inlet, which after that I had done it many, many, many times, which I would take the mast off and lower the mast because it was a deck step mast, and then I would slide underneath the highway because it was very low, and literally you could stand in your boat and touch the highway underneath it, and then I would be out into the ocean. And this was like became one of my great things, how to get into the ocean. The only other way you could really get into the ocean was to go up to Margate, and you could get out up at Margate, or even further, keep going up to Atlantic City, and you could come out of Atlantic City. But just in case that happened, I had a little tiny anchor, and I put it out because I wasn't prepared to go out into the ocean with no wind. There was just no wind. It was really remarkable. Just no wind at all. So as this is going on, my grandfather had become a little bit alarmed at the fact that I wasn't back for dinner. So he came down to the marina, and he was looking around, and he saw that there was no wind. And he knew the second he got there that there was no wind, because usually you get this nice sort of afternoon breeze, evening breeze, then it dies, and then it picks up again and kind of gets back to normal. But there was none of that happening. And so he's, looking out, and he saw me. And I was maybe a mile and a half at that, just basically sitting at anchor as the tide was going out. So my strategy was to wait till the tide changed, and then when the rush started to come in, that I would have enough of the rush to push me, and maybe the wind would pick up and I can get close to the dock and, can do stuff like that. So my grandfather talked to one of the guys who had a little power boat, and they came out and got me and towed me back, which was a great relief because I was really hungry, and I had all these crabs on the boat in traps, and I can't remember if I had anything on the boat to eat. Usually I bought a jar of Jiffy peanut butter and a loaf of bread, and that was usually the food that I would eat when I was on the boat, and a couple of cans of Coke or something like that. But anyway, bottles of Coke, because we didn't have cans back at that point. So I got back to the dock, tied the boat off, and I said, I was good. I was waiting. And they said, no, it wasn't a good idea for you to sit out there like that. And they were being very nice and all the rest of this kind of stuff. And so I went home, we ate dinner, and everybody was relieved. And there was a lot of discussion about why, giving Scott a boat may not be the best idea. He could get himself killed. And, not that I was in any kind of jeopardy whatsoever. I could have very easily had an anchor. I was anchored. There's nothing going on. So the next day, my grandfather and I went back down to the boat together. He drove the car. And we started talking, this, that, another thing. And he says, you know what you need? He says, you need a seahorse. And I'm thinking, seahorse. What's a seahorse going to do for me? But what he was referring to was a Dodgson 5.5 horsepower motor, outboard motor for the boat. And Johnson's 5.5 horsepower motor was called a seahorse. They had a whole line called the seahorses, right? 5.5 horsepower seahorses, Dodgson. And back then they were kind of expensive, but we got a used one from a guy with another boat. He says, yeah, it runs, and so we bought this used, and this was my first dealing with outboard motors, by the way, which have plagued me as a boat and yacht captain for all my career. Not necessarily plagued me, but I do understand them very well. And so any case, I ended up with this 5.5 horsepower Dodgson Seahorse outboard motor. And Pop, it was very light. They're not heavy. Pop just handed it to me and he says, this is just in case. That's what you're going to use it for. This is just in case. And that's really where I'm going with this. It's called just in case. Just in case has everything to do with sort of a precautionary measure. In other words, there's an alternate case if the original doesn't work. So my case here is that this Dodgson was my auxiliary motor just in case the wind died, and I would use that. After that, if the motor died and there was no wind, there was no secondary plan. But what made me think of this concept of just in case, of course, is, safety. Safety is like the biggest thing in the just in case scenario. The life rafts and life vests and flares and radios and waterproof flashlights and every kind of safety equipment you could possibly imagine, all has to do with the just in case scenario. However, in a real weird way, there seems to be more of an abundance of caution in the just in case notion when people are navigating and sailing in oceans and lakes and rivers than would be in other things. Like, what's your just in case scenario for your car? You get a flat tire, you got a spare tire. Boom, thanks, just in case. Boom, you're off. Or you get AAA, whatever, right? You run out of gas station. Somebody comes out to get you. Whatever the case, your engine blows up, all right? Tow trucks, etc. That's where your just in case ends, okay? So there is some planning involved in that, like, making sure you don't run out of gas before you get to a gas station. Making sure you have money in your pocket to pay for the gas in case you need it. All of this is a part of that just in case scenario or planning. And in a lot of social media that I see and a lot of people that write me, there's a lot of questions and they all seem to have this word planning. Sometimes the word is used sort of apologetically. I'm an obsessive planner, so this is natural. Or it's demonstratively the importance of planning for your ship sinking, what to do when trapped on a lee shore, grounded, advanced planning to get you off the bottom, planning for pirates. The list of titles that have planning in them for sailors is just insane. There's tons of titles, tons of stories, just in case. You look at pilots, for example, right? And flying planes, what's their just in case? Their just in case is getting the plane on the ground as fast as possible if there's some sort of disaster. Otherwise, there's very little just in case kind of safety involved with it. They build a system around planes so the planes can do it. But in boats, people don't generally see the system because there is a system. But they generally, as a pleasure boater, you don't see the system. You're not actively a part of what the system is. So I would argue that just-in-case notions and behaviors are very different than, say, Plan B ideas. Plan B sort of represents a parallel plan. For example, like if you have a life raft or you've decided to use your dinghy as your life raft, that's sort of a Plan B, right? If we sink, Plan B is we have a life raft. If we sink, Plan B is we have a dinghy. Now, I've always sort of enjoyed the idea of a dinghy being a life raft. And there's a few stories, and I think I've actually told them about my friends whose boat sank coming out of Madagascar in the Indian Ocean. And they put 55-gallon drums of diesel fuel and probably about 50 or 60 gallons of gasoline. And they put that into their life raft and then towed their life raft with their dinghy and their Yamaha 15 horsepower outboard motor. And they went 250 miles in open sea, mixing gasoline with diesel to make it last. And they eventually made it to Durban, South Africa. A pretty crazy story. And totally believable because I know the guys who did it, and this is the kind of stuff that they were prone to doing. They were, as we would say, real Plan B kind of guys. But just in case, to me, is more a response to sort of a perpendicular interruption of all plans. It's a kind of slash or a crash, like the mast breaking and falling into the water, or having a fire consume your yacht that's been new for 1 month. I had this happen to a friend of mine coming out of Corfu. Brand new boat, basically mega yacht. I think it was about 125, 130 feet. Italian built, I believe. The owner's first vacation on it came out of Corfu. It was night. They were out. The first mate was talking to the captain, and the first mate looked at they were in the pilot house. The crew was resting. They were making the transit across the Ionian to Italy. And he looked at the cameras because on big yachts, there's cameras everywhere, and especially cameras in the engine room that are constantly scanning the engine room. And he looked down, and there was nothing but smoke in the engine room. And he sounded the alarm, got everybody up, called Mayday. The engine stopped running, and the boat literally burst into flames. They got everybody off into life rafts, Mayday, a whole shooting match. They were rescued by a U.S. Navy ship, and the boat burnt to the waterline. Brand new boat. Now that's what I call just in case, because there was nothing that Plan B was going to do. I mean, they had a failure of immense proportions in the fire suppression kit. Didn't work. Brand new boat. Who thinks that it wouldn't work? So this next experience is that they went through and getting on that's just in case something happens. You have the last alternative, the last thing you could do. And in this case, the last thing they thought they were going to do was use their brand new life rafts and their brand new radios to get the hell off a burning boat. So it seems to me like it's just in case is not like the first plan, like Sure, you're going to have fire suppression. Sure, you're going to have life rafts. But you never think that you're going to have to, one will fail and you have to use the others to sit in the middle of the Ionian Ocean until you get a U.S. Navy ship who heard your mayday come by and get you. So to me, just in case is kind of the outer limits of a tree diagram of cause and effect. And a lot of sailors have this in their mind to say that just in case this happens, just in case, and they never get off the dock because they're into this just in case. They're getting that tree diagram out. If A happens, then B happens. If B happens, we'll have to go to C, and on and on and on and on until, the tree diagram becomes this universe of what ifs and just in cases. All right. And the just in case means you have to act on that. Just in case means you have to go and, should I get a big life raft, a little life raft? When am I going to need it? Do I really need something like this? Should I go get a, PFD and what kind of PFD? Is it just, am I just going to be out in the lake or on the river? It's like no big deal. Or, do I have to figure that, I'm in the middle of the ocean and I could be there for days and days and days? This is what you go through. But judgment and experience tells us that the issue of just in case is just adding security. It's adding assurance. But throughout the history of sailing, this just in case attitude or thought was introduced first in a very dominant way by Fulton's steamship. Now, I bring this up in sort of a historical context because sailors and sailing big ships and the great ships, the age of sail, which came to the end because of steamships, required lots of people. They required, great expense, great sails, great number of 300 people to sail these big ships. And the military, the Navy, had to fight on both sides and the platforms and all the rest of this kind of stuff. But they had reached a maturity of their technology and they knew what they needed. So they didn't have any kind of just-in-case scenarios with the technology of the boat. You see? They could shift masts. If a mast broke, you had carpenters there just in case to repair the mast. I mean, there was a lot of built-in experience in keeping a great ship running and keeping it, fixed and maintained. And when Fulton introduced steam engines, no one trusted it. No one trusted steamships. They didn't trust it in so much that Fulton's Folly, the ship with the steam engine in it, still had 2 masts and sails and the people to put them up. So this discomfort of being without answers to the just-in-case question was an important concept. And it's sort of this really strange line of thinking and thought and behavior that we find in sailing. So that was in 1807. And riverboats were really the first ones to abandon the sail. And that was more of a practical thing because on a river, it's very hard to sail on a river if you're confined. The wind, there's always wind shade. And if they had a problem with the steamship engine, they would just go and put it against the shore. They weren't out of distance, but in the sea, it took several millennia to get through this terrifying step of not having sails and masts. The American packet city of Savannah crossed the Atlantic under steam in 1819. It hadn't reached Ireland before it used up all its coal and had to run up its sails. When Britain's steam-powered Great Western established a regular transatlantic passenger service in 1837, it carried sail. So here's this really mature technology, sailing, sailors, traveling, oceans, and then this new technology, steamships. Trying to get rid of that, I think we all kind of get hung up on ideas in our past, or hung up on things that we know, and being older than many people, that I'm very aware of having those old things, those old ideas clinging to my thought processes. So I guess the question is how long do you suppose it took to gain confidence to give up having your sails, your masts and crew and rigging? Surprisingly enough, it probably happened, according to some historians, between the Monitor and the Merrimac in 1862. Both those vessels were steam-powered, ironclad ships, and they didn't carry a sail because they weren't meant to be shoreline vessels. They were just round rivers. Not everyone realizes that there were only two in the great armada of ironclad riverboats. The Union made effective use of them in the Civil War, and ironclad gunboats helped the Union Army gain control of the Mississippi River and in the West. So the Monitor had an entirely different new feature at the time, which was a gun turret where the mast would have been. And at the very same time, the British Admiralty, being very conservative, was trying to replace its fixed guns. If you remember, most of the guns were fixed and they shot out the side and they went in one direction. But the wind played a great deal of, had a great deal of importance in how one conducted battle, always trying to be upwind and being able to, you have to turn your ship to the side to deliver a broadside, etc. But with these ironclad ships, you had rotating turrets. And the problem was that the masts and the rigging interfered with the field of fire. I mean, you can imagine blowing off your mizzen. Oops, sorry about that, sir, was in this battle. So the Monitor, it had no problem because it had no sails. And it could fire on this rotating thing. The Merrimac had actually a mast. And so this led to chip away at the idea of having to have masts. Once the military, the Navy, realized that steam was somewhat reliable, and I say somewhat reliable, and the development of steam ships and steam engines was going on, because at this point, you have to remember, this is 1862. We're really beginning to get into the age of mechanical development. Things are like the Singer sewing machine was being developed, which was, if you've ever looked at a sewing machine, there's a million little parts in a sewing machine. And these things were starting to evolve, and they were evolving exponentially. Okay, so this idea that the steamship could take over for sail as a kind of permanent propulsion system was hanging around, but there's still a lot of apprehension. The first commercial diesel-powered vessels were built in 1904, and it was Petite Pierre, a French canal boat that was 125 feet long and had a 25 horsepower engine with a variable pitch propeller for reversing. Think about that. I mean, the big deal about having a variable pitch propeller today, we go on endlessly about this idea. It's a lot of conversation, and eventually we'll address different types of propellers and stuff. I have a friend who I will say is one of the inventors of the variable pitch prop. But in any case, this was a barge, okay, and it was used in the inland waters of the Marne and the Rhine canals. So it's just another riverboat kind of thing, but it led the development in diesel power. And this was beginning in the machine age, so to speak, and ships were beginning to, and sailors and the people who built them, the boatyards, were beginning to actually embrace them. But step back a little bit to 1890 and Rudolf Diesel, okay, young engineer. He was working on steam engines that almost killed him. It blew up and almost killed him. And so he started to construct a diesel engine on the theory of radiation heat engine to replace the steam engine and combustion engine. There was a gas combustion engine. It was a very inefficient engine. And the diesel engine, which the question is what stops a diesel engine? Answer is there's only two things. No air, no fuel. That's the only two things. What stops a gasoline engine? No air, no fuel, no electricity. Read into that what you want. So at the time, steam engines wasted as much as, say, 90% of the fuel that it was powered by. And that only gave them like a 10% efficiency rating, where diesel's invention was a compression ignition engine, which everybody knows diesel. What a diesel is, that's after Mr. Diesel. But it had an efficiency of about 73%. So it was really, really a huge breakthrough. And this is at a time when people were not into conservation. They didn't care how much coal they used. They had plenty of coal. They didn't care about the air and the environment. It wasn't even a concept at this particular point. So his diesel engine, when they tested it, only ended up to be about 26% efficient, whereas the gas powered internal combustion engines at the time were way less than that. And if you want to really look at it, the Mercedes-Benz engine in a Formula One car today is using about 51% fuel efficiency, which is quite amazing. Really amazing. So in 1899, the diesel engines that were being built in Germany, Switzerland, Russia, and the United States. And strangely enough, guess who got the diesel engine contract to be built? And that was Adolphus Busch, who was building his Budweiser beer brand in the U.S. And Busch's company built the first diesel engine in the United States. A little trivia there. So every time you start your diesel, raise a glass to Mr. Busch. But for marine propulsion, diesel engines had kind of two options. And this is another just in case kind of scenario. And because steam engines, predominantly used paddles on the outside of the boat. And if you see these paddle ships, I'm thinking back to Robert Smalls, the famous, amazing hero who stole a Confederate side paddle boat, big 167-foot long, basically a platform for cannon, stole it in the middle of the night and escaped from the Confederacy past Fort Sumter and turned the boat over and became a hero of the Union Army. He also became a congressman from South Carolina. Quite a remarkable human being. I'm going to do a piece on him later in the next month or so, because he was a sailor, and I want to talk a little bit about that stuff. But anyway, I diverge. You have two ways of getting the marine propulsion out. First, you could use a rotating crankshaft to the propeller. Pretty much what you see today in most boats. Or you could use a generator and you make electricity and you have a battery-operated motor. We all know what these battery-operated and the efficiency of the motors today are absolutely brilliant. And much of that comes from the submarine area, an area that we don't talk very much about sailing-wise, but submarines are certainly a major part of military naval history and development. I mean, in 1902, the French were building a submarine that was a diesel-electric. And what was interesting about these diesel-electrics, and I go back, and as well as the Germans were building them, and they're known as the MAN company. You see MAN diesel engines all over the place, and usually bigger trucks, etc. But they built submarine propulsion systems. And the sinking of the Lusitania was done by a German submarine with a MAN diesel engine in it running silently with a propulsion system from an electric motor. So the diesel would charge the batteries as a generator, and then the batteries would go to the electric motor, and the electric motor would drive the propulsion and the prop of the boat inside. Now, this was incredibly advanced technology. And I have to really set the scene because at the turn of the century, 1900s, 1904, 1911, even 1920s, there were still a lot of ships with masts and sailors. A lot of them. And there were a lot of sailors becoming very unemployed because this technology was taking over. And in fact, I read an interesting statistic that most of the unemployment or people losing their jobs is not because people are shipping jobs out of our country, but because of the technologies replacing those jobs. And this is a perfect example of that. The propulsion systems kept the sailor off the boat. No longer needing wind, can use variable pitch propellers. We get a 125-foot boat, submarines, both mechanical and electric. So to continue on with this whole idea, the diesel electric motors became, and they've changed, obviously they've developed a lot, but they created this reversible DC motors so they can go forward and reverse, okay? And that concept also helped railroad locomotives. So they use it's the same design used today. It hasn't changed. Parts have obviously improved, but it hasn't changed. So the first super large seagoing ship was powered by diesel engines, was called the Salandia, which was built in 1911. It was a Danish liner built for cargo and passenger trade for a run between Thailand and Scandinavia. The ship was 370 feet in length. It was capable of carrying 7,400 tons, and it was propelled by two diesel engines. Two 1,050 horsepower engines drove the ship at 11 knots. Since the Salandia was not powered by steam, there were no smokestacks needed for the coal smoke, which would give off a remarkable silhouette for a ship of that era. The diesel exhaust went through her rear mast. This caused a new breed of diesel ships to be called smokeless or phantom ships. So there's an interesting thing, your phantom ship, which is in fact a diesel engine ship and not a steam coal-driven ship. But there's kind of this other kind of curious apprehension in the just-in-case concept, which is the stern tube. I had alluded to it earlier in some of the first ships that were built, but in 1843, a young engineer, civil engineer, mechanical and civil engineer named, let me get his name right, Isambard Kingdom Brunel. That was his name, Isambard Kingdom Brunel. And in 1843, he designed the first iron-built ocean-going ship, the SS Great Britain. I've referred to this before because of its rudder, because it was the first to have an interior rudder and one that wasn't hung off the back of the boat with pintles. And this boat, was the first vessel to use a stern tube, which was closed off by a simple stuffing box. Now, a lot of you guys, sailors, girls too, know all about the whole stuffing box thing. But the concept, the reluctance of people to put a hole in the aft peak of their boat so that they could stick a shaft in it and have a propeller and push it along was a concept that people resisted. Like, this is it. You take away my sails, and now I have to put a hole in the bottom of my boat. This is the way people were thinking at the time. This is exactly the way people were thinking. So this concept of the stern tube, in other words, running a shaft for propeller through the aft of your boat and not having water come rushing in, was a really, really important concept. A number of years ago, I was driving an old Morgan, 50-foot Morgan. I was just doing a temporary captain's gig for a charter, because the charter captain at the time was ill, and they had all these charters, so they hired me to kind of do it. And when you jump on a boat, you do a quick inspection. Mostly you should do a really good inspection. That could be another podcast. But in this case, you do a quick inspection, and I had done that, and then we were off. And we were in the harbor in Virgin Gorda in the Caribbean. And if anybody knows the little harbor there, the marina there, they will know what I'm talking about. So as I came in and we're getting ready to go into, we were assigned to slip. We were getting ready to go into the slip. And I put the engine in reverse because I was pivoting the boat. And suddenly I had no reverse. I mean, seriously, no reverse. And I couldn't move the rudder. And I went downstairs really fast. And what had happened is when I hit the reverse, it was a fixed prop. When I hit the reverse, the shaft, key and all, had dislodged itself from the transmission. And it was just literally hanging in the bilge. The butt end of the shaft was hanging in the bilge, as water was pouring into the boat. The pumps were taking care of the water. It was holding. It wasn't, like super disaster moment, but it was holding. So we eventually got some lines across. We were pulled up and we tied off to a dock. And I went down and I finally wrestled this shaft back into the transmission. I had lost the key at the end of the shaft in the bilge with all the water. Eventually I found it. I got the key back in, and as I realized, the only thing that was holding this shaft into the transmission was 3 little square bolts. And these bolts have to be tightened, obviously. And I tried tightening them. I tried tightening the whole thing for the shaft, because you had to do it exactly, or the shaft would be off in its alignment. And there were no indentations for these, they're like needle nose bolts to sit. There was nothing to seat them in so that they weren't just sort of scratching the surface of the end of the stainless steel shaft. And it was the most curious design and kind of stupid design that I'd ever seen. Now, on larger boats, you can pull the shaft out, but there are keys. It's bolted into the transmission. It ain't going nowhere. Okay, there's a lot of backup, but this was just like a little tiny 1/4-inch screws saying, "Hey, here you go. Hold that shaft." Insane. So I eventually actually drilled some indentations into the shaft, got some different screws. This is like an all-day affair. Got the whole thing, put a new key in it that was a little higher so that it wouldn't go. So that way that the shaft, when put into reverse, wouldn't pull out of the transmission. But that's just that. And then, of course, I had to pull all the stuffing out of the stern tube and the stuffing box because it had all just been screwed up because the shaft was a wiggly-diggly mess. Now, I know a lot of you people are thinking like, okay, where's he going with all this as far as just in case? Well, the stern tube was the sort of one of the two important concepts of the just in case, which sort of created the whole idea of how we as sailors look at what we do on our boats. We have extra sails, just in case. We have safety equipment, just in case. We have life rafts, just in case. Okay? We have spare radios, just in case. We have EPIRBs, just in case. That whole industry of just in case wasn't a plan B industry. It was a just in case. So the just in case is just like a provision against something happening or being true. Now, I have spent a lot of time on boats. As many of you know, I've been around the world several times. I have crossed the Atlantic back and forth 18 times, or 36 transatlantics. I've been across the Mediterranean. I've sailed the North African coast. I've been into the Red Sea. I've been around to Kenya. I have sailed the Pacific all the way across to Australia, to New Zealand, and back. I've done Hawaii 3 times and back. So I've done a lot of sailing, and there's no more a truism than that the sailor's mental makeup is made up of the concept of just in case. And I'll leave you with one little tiny story. I was changing the stuffing in my box. I was in St. Martin, and my CT-54. And in order to get to that, you had to pull up a deck panel and slide in kind of upside down and put your back on the hull, and then you could reach up to get to the stern tube. It was a very awkward position to get to it. I've always meant to say something to Robert Perry about the awkwardness of that. There could have been a hatch that you could have just reached down and fixed it, but no, we had to slide up underneath the boat almost the full length of my 5'9" frame. And I did it on a nice hot day, Caribbean day. Water was kind of cool, and I did it without having a shirt on. And one of the things that I did, because I had to adjust and over the years replace the stuffing many times, is that in order to set the bracket up against the exterior of the boat, you have these nuts, right, that you have to turn to tighten these bolts, right? And they're big, and they take a special kind of, and I had an adjustable wrench that I knocked a little nail in it, and I hang that adjustable wrench right there. It wouldn't go anywhere. It was on a basic hook. And so whenever I got down there, I could do that. I also had my tool for digging out the stuffing itself, the cloth, the fabric. And I had that stuck there too. And I think I sat at a screwdriver that sat in a little bracket. that would specifically set to the tubes that I could adjust for the water and for the air that would go into the stern tube. And I had it perfectly set up. So I was down there. I was on the boat by myself at anchor and, just doing my daily maintenance. Yeah, I'm going to go down. Okay, it's not something I really like doing a lot of. And I just went down, laid down on the boat, fixed the stern tube, got the stuffing in there, and then I tried to wiggle my way out. Now, you have to understand, I'm underneath the floor of the boat. My feet are up in the air, in the galley, and I'm stuck because my back, without a shirt on, has literally stuck to the hull. I started laughing so hard, I thought, okay, am I going to die this way? I'm going to die because I was replacing the stuffing in the stern tube and I couldn't get out. And the more I laughed, the harder it was to move because it's a very tight spot. Eventually, I took a couple of deep breaths. I exhaled, calmed myself down, and then I just started to move just a little bit, just to wiggle. And eventually I got out of there. And that was my little stern tube story. But anyway, I want to thank you all for listening. Just a little idea about Just In Case is very much a part of sailing and of the sailor's mind. Thank you.
Thanks for sharing, Scott. So what do we have planned for next week?
Yes, thank you, Todd. For next week, I thought I would go with another subject that's more about the dynamics of life and humans and sailing, and tell some stories that are related to things that challenge. Now, I'm not just talking about, being challenged to shoot 10 baskets in a row or challenged to, do whatever task it is that you have to do. But I'm talking about the challenges being something that you have to do and that it's hard to do. I mean, it could be something very daily. It could be something quite impressive and difficult to do, something that you never thought you could do. And I will relate some stories to some of the challenges that I faced in sailing, both in the Middle East and in the Philippines.
Thank you for tuning in. If you like this episode, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Also, be sure to rate and review. You can find us on Facebook and at offshoreexplorer.org. You can also listen to past episodes at offshore-explorer.simplecast.com. Our theme song is sung by Paulette McWilliams, with additional music by Manu Itomi and Tommy Twang.
Until next time, fair winds and calm seas.